Hi everyone, and welcome to our study in the book of Revelation. My intent is to look at the book of Revelation at an in-depth level, not a cursory look, but an in-depth level so we can have a full meaning and full understanding about the book and what it prophesizes that is going to happen, because as you know, we are now living in the last days and the world is plunging towards the tribulation period. And the satanic system, the Babylonian system, is coming, and as the stage is setting. And so we want to be able to tell everybody, okay, what should we be looking for? How are things going to develop? And remember, we're pre-tribulational, so we believe that the rapture will happen prior to the tribulation. We'll get into that in our study. And so we won't be here for the tribulation, but we are seeing the stage set for it. And that's what the book of Revelation talks about in this tribulation, what's going to happen. And so we want to know how the stage is going to be set, because right now we're seeing the convergence of items, whether it's Israel, whether it's digital currency, whether it's globalism. All of the things are coming together. Apostasy of the church in the last days. All these things are converging. And therefore, the book of Revelation is the most appropriate book that we could study in our time. A lot of people, a lot of churches don't study it. In fact, a poll by Lifeway showed that only 2% of the pastors were actually talking anything about prophecy. That in their sermons, 98% of their sermons that they surveyed had nothing to do with the end times. And yet here we are living in the end times and no one's talking about it. So, the book of Revelation is intended to be understood and comprehended fully by believers. It's the revealing of the Messiah's second coming, revealing of the tribulation, and all the things that go on with that. And so the book of Revelation is probably the most neglected book of the Bible, but at the end of the day, it's not that hard to understand. And if you take it in a good, literal sense, as it should be taken. Yes, there's a lot of metaphors, there's a lot of symbolism, but they all point to something concrete and literal. And you have to know what the symbols point to by knowing the Old Testament, because a lot of understanding the book of Revelation, you have to understand the Old Testament. And so anyway, we'll parse that out, and we'll look at that, and you'll start to see that it's not that hard of a book to understand. And again, for some reason, I don't know why, but pastors and churches neglect it, either because of ignorance, or sometimes they just don't like it, or they're afraid to scare somebody because they're part of the church growth movement, or they just ignore it, they cherry pick through it. They don't want to hurt their crowds, obviously. If they teach it, they don't want to scare people. A lot of people have a reformed covenantal view of eschatology, and so it's not even on their radar. They have replacement theology, and unfortunately that lends itself to them not teaching prophecy. For them, it's just Jesus returns and that's it. So they have really no eschatology whatsoever. Or some people are dominionists. They think they're going to usher the kingdom in first and then Jesus returns. And so a lot of people have some misunderstandings about prophecy. That's why it's not taught in the church. I will say this. The history of the church has been really bad on prophecy. It started out great, but then once the Greeks took over and they started allegorizing the scriptures, and then Augustine brought his amillennialism and spiritualizing the text came in, we really have now what we call a Catholic version of eschatology in most churches. It stems from the Catholic Church. And so even the Reformers were ex-priests, and they didn't develop their eschatology. They basically maintained Augustinian eschatology, so they never really developed it. But if you go to the early church, you can see that they believe in Kilianism, or we would call premillennialism, today, as we talk about it today. And they took the Bible and the book of Revelation and Daniel more literally than the churches do today. So when you read the book of Revelation or Daniel or any of the prophetic passages, you have to read them in the literal sense. You cannot allegorize or spiritualize the text like Augustine did or Roman Catholics do. And so there's all kinds of reasons the church doesn't teach this. They think it's not going to be popular with the people or whatever. And it's like, we're living in the last days. Things are going on around us. How could you not teach this book? And then there's a lot of people who are Laodicean and they have end times fatigue and they just don't bother me with this information. Don't depress me. They're so emotionally fragile. They don't want to be told that their world that they live in is coming to an end and the last days are upon us, and so it depresses them, and so they just stick their fingers in their ear and don't want to hear it. So they go to churches like that. And anyway, there's all these reasons of why people don't study the book of Revelation. And that's why there's a special blessing for those who read it and understand it and apply it and obey it. It's one of the only books in the Bible that promises a blessing to those who read and study it and apply it. And so in the study of eschatology, which is the study of the last days, the study of last days prophecy, there's either ignorance about it or just apathy. They're ignorant because of the theology structures they follow, or they're just willfully ignorant, just don't want to know, or they're just apathetic. They don't care. They're indifferent to it. They don't want to mess up their little world or whatever it might be. And so, anyway, this thing is playing out. It's happening right in front of us. And so we need to know it. We need to understand what's happening in our world, and the way we understand it is through prophecy. And unfortunately, at this time, a lot of the pastors and churches are not doing what they should be doing. Dr. Howard Hendricks noted, he said this principle. He goes, you cannot impart what you do not possess. And so a lot of these pastors, a lot of the churches do not know prophecy. They haven't been trained. Even though they went to seminary, at the institutional level at the seminaries, they don't teach it anyway. So a lot of these guys coming out of seminary don't know it. And it's not a developed area of their theology. And so anyway, a lot of them haven't spent the time, and they're not going to, by the way. So unfortunately, there's a deprivation in Christianity, especially in America, about prophecy. And a lot of times the pastor doesn't want to be lumped in with the crazies that come along, the tinfoil hat brigade that comes along with teaching prophecy. But that's to be expected, right? And so they don't want to be labeled like that. But at the end of the day, as a pastor, you still have to teach it. You still have to explain to people what the book of Revelation, what Daniel means, what the Olivet Discourse means, and all these other prophecies. And so, even though they might lump you into like these prophecy charlatans, these date setters, like Harold Camping, you still are obligated to teach it, and teach it in a conservative, biblical way so that people and Christians can understand. But as you know, there's also those pastors who are just absolutely openly hostile to futuristic prophecy. And 2 Peter chapter 3 talked about that there were scoffers would come. One of the things we didn't realize is that the scoffing would come inside the church, not just simply from outside the church. And so right now in Christendom in America, there's a war on Bible prophecy. And it started in our seminaries. It started with liberalism and creating what they say apocalyptic literature should not be taken literally, but should be spiritualized. And it was basically Augustinian. And so they dismissed it. And so they told their pastors that they were teaching in the seminaries not to take the Bible literally in terms of prophecy. And so that's what skewed up everything in the world of prophecy in churches. So many mainline and Reformed churches, they don't take prophecy literally. So this is where the war started. But prophecy is meant to prepare the believers for what's coming. It's meant to create an urgency in them to not only evangelize, but to be sanctified and grow. And it encourages believers' holiness and righteous living. And so when you take prophecy out, you're doing Christians a disservice. And the interesting thing about prophecy is that the generation that lives closest to the time when these things start becoming fulfilled, that generation will understand it the best. And Dr. Walvoord made that point at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I remember having a class with Dr. Walvoord. They had brought in to teach a class at Liberty a long time ago, a week-long class, and he mentioned that, the generation that lives closest to the time when these events occur will understand them the best. And this goes back to Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. It says, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." And it says, "Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end." And so the idea of the knowledge, in the Hebrew, it's not just knowledge in general, it's the knowledge. And the knowledge refers back to the prophecies Daniel was making. Well, in his day, he didn't understand a lot of what he was saying. And so a lot of what he was saying was to be sealed up. Well, it is John in the book of Revelation that unseals the rest of this and opens the door for us to understand. And now you and I living in this period of time in which we can see a lot of how these things would come about, understand prophecy better than 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So the knowledge has increased. We understand prophecy better than we ever have because we live closest to that time. So yes, what Daniel prophesied is happening. The knowledge of prophecy has increased. So as often is the case in the nature of prophecy, that it typically cannot be fully understood until the time of the generation which achieves fulfillment. And so it's 1,000 years ago they looked at the book of Revelation or Daniel and it was foggy to them. They understood the general idea of where it was going, but they didn't understand the details like you and I. Like for instance, you and I could understand the mark of the beast pretty easy of how one person can control the whole world by them taking a mark, and that would allow them to buy or sell. We could understand how that could possibly happen. We understand what a digital currency. We understand what artificial intelligence, which John seems to hint at in Revelation 13. We understand those things. And so it doesn't take a lot of faith to believe that because it's so evident in front of us. So that's the great thing about living in the days in which things are fulfilled. You understand them better. And that's where we're at. And we want to take each item and look at them in depth to see how things are developing right now. As we now jump in to get ready to study, here's the first principle that I want to make. We must understand that once the day of fulfillment comes, there will be no delay in its execution, is the idea. So if you look at Revelation 1, it says this, the revelation or apocalyptis, which the Greek means a disclosure. So the revelation or the disclosure of Jesus Christ, which God gave him, the idea of God gave him, thus this is talking about divine authority, and the origin of this is emphasized. It's the direct word of God is given, obviously, about Jesus Christ and the information coming through the Messiah from the Father. And most interpret it as information hidden now, which is now revealed, and it's coming from Jesus, okay? So it's something hidden, but now revealed. And again, that goes back to the sealing up of prophecy in Daniel 12:4, and now it's revealed about Jesus, and more is revealed about the rise and fall of kingdoms, judgments on the earth, final judgment, the millennium, the eternal state, etc. And it goes on to show his servants, to unveil his plan and purposes to his doulos. The doulos is his servants, a special kind of servant, a servant who stayed with his master out of love, who was once set free. And so he's showing us believers what the program will be, about the future events and about himself and the second coming and all the things that transpire in the book of Revelation. And then he says, which must shortly take place. It's entake. It is the Greek word that's used for this. It means a season of time, and it's probably referring to Daniel's reference to the time of the end, right? And it's not that the event will necessarily occur immediately. That's not what John is saying. But it is the next event that'll happen. In other words, it means that once the day of fulfillment comes, there will be no delay in its execution, is the idea. It will happen suddenly. It will happen with rapidity in its execution after the beginning takes place. And once it begins, it will be a sudden execution of it. Okay, so the idea is, look what you're looking at now. Look how fast things are rapidly developing. Now, we're talking about birth pains. We're not talking about the tribulation period, in what we're talking about. So with these birth pains that Jesus promised that would come, they would get more intense, they would get more frequent. And what we're noticing is the rapidity of that. Once these birth pains start, things have started to develop. Look in the last 10 years of how fast things have devolved in the world, morally, ethically. Look at the system of globalism, how fast they've put this into place. Look at the digital currency that they're wanting to enact. Look what happened just this last year through the coronavirus shutdown. Look at all the things they started putting in place very rapidly. That's what Jesus was saying, that once something that's prophesied begins, it starts happening very quickly, very fast. And that's the idea. And then the second point we want to make is this, that if you continue to read, hear, and obey the book of Revelation, then the book promises a special blessing or reward. And it says this in verse 1. And he sent and signified it, or the idea of signified it, signs, or basically makes a signal. This is a Jewish way of talking. It's symbolic, right? That the revelation is going to come through symbols. So he sent it and signified it. So this revelation is symbolic. So what you see in the book of Revelation, there's a lot of symbols. But it's not a puzzle. It's not a mystery. The symbolism is explained. So for instance, there's 404 verses in the book of Revelation, and 278 are an allusion or an allusions to the Old Testament. And so if the symbolism is not tied to an Old Testament passage, what will happen is John will then explain what the symbolism means. So every time you see a symbol, it points to the Old Testament. If it doesn't point to the Old Testament, he explains it. That's how Revelation is being signified. And so all these symbols, though, point to a literal thing. The symbolism is not just symbolism. It doesn't stay at that level, and that you get to pour your own meaning into it. It's symbolic of literal things that will be fulfilled in a literal, normal way. That's what that John is trying to say. So that's why when people approach the book of Revelation, they approach it from a non-literal, allegorical approach. They're approaching it the way Augustine did, the way the School of Alexandria did, which is Greek, pagan, Neoplatonism, dualism, and all this spiritualizing of the text. That's what happens to people who just simply read into the symbols. That's a wrong approach. And again, it's the dominant view in a lot of churches, in a lot of seminaries, and a lot of denominations, but it's wrong. And so you'll have some approaches to try to approach the book of Revelation in a historical approach, like postmillennialism, where it's symbolic of church history, which is nonsense. Many in the Reform camp, because of the Reformers, take this view. They take the view of Luther and Calvin on this stuff. Then you have preterist approach, which tries to make everything happen before 70 AD. And again, where did preterism come from? It came from a Jesuit priest, Alcazar, in response to Luther and the Reformers' accusation that the Pope was the Antichrist. So basically, it was in reaction to that. So everything happened before 70 AD, so they couldn't call the Pope the Antichrist. So again, Preterism doesn't work, and then it originated out of the Jesuit order of Catholicism. So basically what you have to understand is the literalness of what the symbols point to. And again, Dr. John Walvoord, one of the great prophecy professors and scholars, identified more than 1,000 prophecies in his book, the Bible Prophecy Handbook. And of those prophecies, more than half have literally been fulfilled, which assures us that the other half that are not fulfilled yet but will be fulfilled in the future will also be fulfilled literally. That's how you're to take this. And so once you realize that, the book of Revelation becomes easy to interpret. You just understand what the symbol is, and it points to something very literal. That's simple hermeneutics. So as the early church interpreted the book of Revelation, we interpret it like the early church as well. It was called Killianism. That was another word for what we call futurism. That's the best explanation, the most consistent interpretation of the book of Revelation or Daniel or any end times prophecy. So we're following the path of the generations that lived during the time of the apostles and the early church until it started getting taken over by Greek influence and started allegorizing and spiritualizing the text. And people will question, well, how do you know you're taking these prophecies the right way? Well, guess what? Moses teaches us in Genesis how to interpret prophecy. So in Genesis, there are 12 prophecies, right, that are made, and they actually come to fruition within Genesis. And all of them are literal. So the rule is, when the plain sense makes sense, don't look for any other sense lest you end up with nonsense. And so we go to Moses to teach us how to interpret prophecy. And basically, there was a lot of symbolism, but they all came fulfilled literally. They literally took place. And so that eliminates bad interpretive methods such as allegorization, spiritualization, or metaphorically taking things. So, we get our cues from Moses, okay? So let's continue in the text. And it says this, by his angel, and maybe this is Gabriel, we don't know, to his servant John. Notice that John is not called an apostle, but simply a doulos, a slave, a servant, his servant John, a doulos slave. It's the humbleness of John, right? Because John is writing this. In verse 2 it says this, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, to all things that he saw. So the idea that John is an eyewitness to the risen, glorified Messiah, obviously, and what he saw with Christ in the ministry of Christ, but then also what he saw in the visions about the future. So basically what John is trying to say is that he's claiming that what I'm about to tell you is the truth from God himself. He has unveiled to John what is going to happen in the future. That's what John is trying to get across. So this is not a human speculation on his part or just a mere religious reflection on John's part. He says, I've actually received information from God and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen in the future. So, every person who reads the book of Revelation must make a decision. Either John is conveying precisely what God had said, or John is guilty of deception or lying. Now, as believers, you know John is not trying to deceive or lie. But this is what John is trying to state. It doesn't give you the ability to be neutral on the book of Revelation. Either he's telling the truth and you take it in the literal way that you're supposed to take. You take the symbols in a literal way and understand the program of God. Or you discount what he's saying and say, well, John doesn't understand what he's talking about. You patronize John in some way. Well, he's sincere, but he doesn't understand things. And you don't take the book of Revelation seriously, which a lot of people don't. That's the problem. And so John doesn't give you any neutral position. You either take what he says or you don't. And then in verse 3, John then gives the blessings, the Beatitudes. There's actually 7 Beatitudes in the book of Revelation. This is the first one of the Beatitudes, the blessings that come with it. So in verse 3, it says, blessed is he who reads And the idea is it's referring to the singular person who reads this in public to the congregation or teaches it. Blessed is he who reads or teaches. And those who hear the words of this prophecy, that's the people in the church, the congregation who hear it. And notice John does not call this apocalyptic literature, he calls it prophecy. Okay? He calls it prophecy. That's important. That's a point. Because people today accuse Revelation of being a genre which they've overlaid on the Bible called apocalyptic literature, and they label it that way so they can spiritualize the whole thing. But you can't do that. Prophecy is not meant to do that. Prophecy is meant to be taken in a literal way once you understand the symbolism. And so the idea is, if they call it apocalyptic literature, which a lot of people do, then you cannot know what it means, a lot of times they say. And so we don't want to call this apocalyptic literature. We want to call it prophecy. And we got to keep the two distinct. Apocalyptic literature allows liberals to make it say whatever it wants to say, or say it's just unknowable. We can't know what it means. That's wrong. We call prophecy prophecy because we know what prophecy means. So John says to the congregation, and those who hear the words of this prophecy, and then he says this, and keep. The idea of keep is obey or observe those things which are written in it. So in an early church, not everybody would have a copy of the book of Revelation. I mean, there would just be one copy, so it couldn't be distributed out to people to take it home or anything like that. So the idea is all those who are participating in this would need to keep doing it, keep reading it, keep hearing it, keep obeying it, because they couldn't go home and read it for themselves. So when they met together, they had to keep doing this. They had to keep reading the book. They had to keep hearing it and obeying it. That's the idea here. This book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, is the only book that has a direct blessing attached to it with a threefold scope. Well, why the blessing? It anticipates that many believers would neglect it and would ignore it or even scoff at it and reject it. And then you see how the Catholic Church took it, and Augustine took it and messed it all up and allegorized it and spiritualized it. So this is why there's a blessing attached to it, because it would be the most neglected book of the Bible. God knew it would be opposed, not only from the outside of the church, but inside the church through false doctrine. So obviously, what's behind all this opposition to the book of Revelation? It's Satan. Satan is behind all of this. Why? Because the book of Revelation threatens to spell the doom of the kingdom of darkness. It tells people and Satan what will happen to the kingdom of darkness. It spells it out. And God has given his word on it. And God has signed, sealed, and delivered it. And so basically it is as good as done. So when unbelievers read this, they become afraid because it's a threat of judgment. And obviously, if they don't take God's grace and mercy, then this is what they will get if they're left behind. And so that's why a lot of people don't like it. But to the believer, it gives godly fear. It gives the believer hope. It encourages the believer to evangelize. It encourages watching the table get set. It encourages us to warn people about what's getting ready to happen. And it gets the church's priorities straight. It gets the believer's priorities straight. Because we're focusing in on the future and not so much on the here and now, and pointing to the Messianic age and the age that God has for us, that hope that we have. And so it really aligns everything. But if you take prophecy out, it really will mess up the believer. Their hope is gone. Their future is gone. They don't know their future. It makes them not so urgent in evangelism and growth. So you can see why the devil's strategy would be to misalign the book of Revelation and get it off the radar. And now what's happened? When the book of Revelation is not on the radar, what does the church get into? Social gospel, social justice stuff. And that's the new fad that churches do. They don't think about the future. They're trying to create a paradise on earth through social justice. And so the last point I want to make before we conclude is this. We must watch for the things contained in prophecy and be on the alert for the fulfillment of these things. So the idea is we're to be a watchman on the wall. And as you watch these things, these tables start getting set up for what's going to happen in the tribulation, we're to warn people. We're to let them know about what's happening and where this is all going. We need to get the truth out to people. And so in verse 3 it says, for the time is near. Now the idea here is that the season is near. It's the Greek word kairos, or era, or season. Obviously it's later than it's ever been. And the tribulation, obviously, is next on God's calendar. And the rapture comes before that, obviously. But the big prophetic event in the book of Revelation is the tribulation. That's what it's talking about. So with all that said, we have the birth pains that are happening prior to the tribulation. You have the rapture that's going to happen prior to the tribulation. And there's a lot of other pre-tribulational events. The setting of the stage is all happening. And therefore, we have the duty to warn people, to let them know, hey, the time is drawing near. Don't be left behind, because the rapture is going to happen. And the rapture could happen at any point in time. And then when you see the setting up of the global government, the setting up of the digital currency, the global religion, the global economy, all of that is prophetic. We're supposed to sound the alarm saying, this is where it's going. And so we're in the prophetic calendar of the last days. And as Jesus noted, he said you wouldn't know the day or the hour. That's true. But Paul then comes in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and he says that we would recognize the season. That we're not in darkness, but we're in the light, he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And therefore we would recognize the season that we're in. Not the day or the hour, but the season. And so the season we're in is the last days of the church age. And obviously the stage is setting for the tribulation. So let's make an application before we go. The application is this. Many of us who are studying prophecy are awake to it. We understand what's happening. We see the convergence of things. But many Christians still sleep. There's a reason they're sleeping. There's a reason they're not paying attention. They're not staying spiritually alert. And a lot of it has to do with the churches they go to, the pastors they follow. They simply don't care about prophecy. But unfortunately, the world is going in this direction. We're seeing it and witnessing it. And hopefully, people are going to wake up. That's my hope, that people will start waking up to what's happening when they see all these things start going down like they have been in this last year. The remnant seems to always get it. They're always alert. But we're hoping more of the Laodicean element wakes up to this and becomes attentive to prophecy. It's the weirdest thing that here we are in the convergence of all these prophecies and all these table settings are starting to happen, and yet the believers in the American church and Western society are the most ignorant of prophecy. And again, I don't know if it's willful or just because of the churches they go to. They just don't know it. Maybe they just don't want to know it. I don't know. But now it's time to wake up. And it's time to start becoming alert. Start paying attention. And start paying attention to what the world is doing, where it's going, so that we can prepare. See, Francis Schaeffer said this a long time ago, and he's right. He goes, one of the things that's going to lull people to sleep, well, I should say two things, he said, that's going to lull people to sleep is personal affluence and personal peace. Personal affluence has to do with wealth. Obviously, wealth can put you to sleep. You still care. And the other one is personal peace, which means that someone would just wants to be left alone. They want their little house, they want to come home, not be bothered by the outside world, and pretend that none of this is happening around them. He says if someone could be convinced of that, and you couple that with personal peace, it'll put them to sleep spiritually. And it has. It's put a lot of Christians asleep, unfortunately. But again, what do we have to do? What is our job? You and I are watchmen on the wall. And we have to alert people. We have to alert the unbelieving world to get saved. And we have to alert the believers who are spiritually asleep, the Laodicean element, and to get them awake as well, because Jesus is returning soon for the church. And this whole thing that we see setting up is going to go lead right into the tribulation period. So let's wake up, let's be alert, and let's warn and not be silent. So continue to study with us. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.